The cost of data has led to a movement called #DataMustFall, initiated by popular radio host Thibaut Touch this past week. This prompted Parliament to hold hearings about the structure of the costs, and the public calls for urgent action to be taken by the telecommunication companies. In the connected and globalized society, South Africa's average data costs are priced way above international and even comparative country averages. And we are trying to better understand how these prices are set and to shed light on the promise by telecommunications regulator ICASA. I'm joined by the CEO of Strategy Wokx, Stephen Ambrose. Stephen, pleasure to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Much appreciated to have you with us. Now, data very expensive. That's the perception, that's the view that South Africans have. And of course, some have checked against emerging markets and they find that it's way above. And we've been using cell phones in particular for some time now.
There's no question that the cost of data is high. Generally, I've looked at the averages, I've looked at the costs around the world. I've also looked at this current idea of we are so much more expensive than everywhere else. The simple fact is we're not. We're in the lower 30% of data costs globally. That doesn't mean that it's affordable. I think the key thing to understand is that it doesn't matter how much something costs. If you can't afford it, it's not possible.
It's costly for you.
It's too costly for you.
Yeah.
So the real challenge that we've got in this country is no question that our data costs are high. The networks do maintain that they've spent an unbelievable amount of money, which they have. It's hundreds of billions of rands, creating a network that's arguably the finest in Africa by a long chalk. In fact, I believe our data networks and our mobile networks are better than some of the networks in the UK, some of the networks in the US. Only some really advanced economies in Europe and the Far East have better quality networks than we have.
But I've had the argument being made, Stephen, that Nigeria, for instance, data costs there are much
They are much
cheaper
lower for a simple reason. Their data networks are very poor. They've far lower technology. They've only just, in very limited areas, introduced the so-called 4G LTE networks. So their networks are much smaller, much lower cost, and much more centered on the major centers. So the minute you leave Lagos, for example, and not the entire part of Lagos, the center of Lagos, you have very, very poor connectivity.
So it may be cheaper, but it's
cheaper, but it's not very
because
useful.
you don't.
Kenya, which is one of the digital lights in Africa, has lower costs than us. Bharti Airtel came in, it's a big Indian operator, slashed costs, made it incredibly cost effective. But anyone who's been to Kenya and been to those areas can tell you that the quality of the data in patches is excellent, but overall it's very poor. But that's one argument. There's no question that in South Africa our data costs are high and they have not come down for many years. And there's lots of good reasons.
I'll come back to some of the points you've made, but a thought that's crossing my mind is that when you go to some centers, including municipalities, we have free access, Wi-Fi access, and you can use the data there for free.
Absolutely. And however, I have a real problem with so-called free Wi-Fi. Nothing in this world is free. Someone is paying. Shwani have spent 170 million rand of taxpayers' money providing free Wi-Fi to their citizens. So the same, I do believe there are a lot of solutions. One of them is, like water, give people a minimum access to a certain amount of data every month to use. There are a lot of ways of doing that. But the huge, and I think the big bear, or the elephant in the room right now, is that government have been messing around with their spectrum policy for 10 years. Many countries around the world have gone digital. Many countries around the world are using the latest technologies, which are far more efficient, both in spectrum and in cost, and are able to bring down data costs. So one of the key issues that the networks keep talking about that people tend to ignore, and I mean, they have parliamentary hearings about the cost of data, but they don't have parliamentary hearings about ICASA being sued by the Department of Communications.
Which,
so the one part of the government is being sued by another part of the government.
Exactly, which should be a priority anyway.
Absolutely. So they've been promising us, and I remember talking to people, operators, in 2006, 10 years ago, about exactly the same problem they have now. The voice spectrum is full. We've got 80 million connections. People are making calls. They're filling up that spectrum. You can see it. You go into Sandton and you find suddenly your voice quality is terrible. You can't make a call.
But just tell me, I mean, what is the relevance of the spectrum question, right? What ICASA is trying to do and being sued by the telecommunications department. What difference would the spectrum make to this debate and discussion
It's very simple.
around data?
GSM, that's the global standard for telecommunications, was set up for a voice network initially.
Sure.
Certain spectrum, certain frequencies were allocated to voice.
Yes.
They were filled up and used by voice. And South Africa, having a large proportion of people who don't have smartphones, still quite heavily dependent on voice, although the numbers are showing that that is starting to tail off as people adopt WhatsApp and other methods and data. But there are other spectrums that are far better for data and are being deployed globally across the world for high speed data spectrum. And because of that, they're much more efficient. So the technology to use it gives you a much lower cost per megabit than trying to use old technology and old spectrum. So theoretically, if the government allocated all these high demand so-called spectrum to the operators who've got the money to put up all the masts, spend billions of rands modernizing their networks, they would then be able to charge far less per megabyte because their costs of supplying that would be far less. The old networks are voice-centric, the new networks are fully data-centric, but they need multiple frequencies to operate at the speeds and offer sufficient capacity to give massive data. So, for example, if we have, right now, there's around about 20 million people using smartphones. If we had 50 million people using smartphones, you wouldn't be able to make a voice call. The spectrum that's currently allocated would be so overloaded,
I understand.
you wouldn't be able to use it.
The problem is that the volume is huge.
Correct.
And the infrastructure, the capacity to deal with data type.
Transactions
on the then they will overload the system.
Correct.
For now, the system can cope with voice, but if it were to be data rich or have a lot
more
of
data rich,
yes, and a lot of people transacting,
Correct.
communicating using data, then it would
actually fall over.
Yeah.
And the problem is the costs of running data over current networks is far higher than running data over the more advanced networks that use these new frequencies which have not been allocated by ICASA. Now, ICASA tried to do so, and the government said, whoa, we don't agree with you.
But why is government then not taking responsibility for that and say, hey, before you go anywhere with your data must fall, which we understand. I mean, if you're paying, you will feel the effect of it, right? And you won't like it. But to say, look, we can fix this problem. Let's just sort out the spectrum allocation.
Look, don't overstate that. There's no question that's one of the elements that are keeping the costs high. The other elements are competition. The other elements are simply the fact that the networks are trying to balance the high margin voice against low margin data. Understand, they're selling a commodity that every year gets cheaper and the demand goes up. So imagine selling 1 million bananas at lower cost than your purchase price. So it becomes very complicated. But there's no question that one of the huge stumbling blocks is the simple lack of policy from our current government with regard to spectrum allocation.
But there's another argument, Stephen, that says as long as data is that expensive, there are a lot of things that are not happening that would assist the economy, and also education, that students would be going on the internet to download whatever material they need to assist them with their studies. And if you're running business, a whole number of things, right? That therefore the benefits that would come with cheaper data are not accruing to the economy.
There's no question about that. I think those arguments are very hard to refute. There's direct correlation between the use of the internet, the use of data, and economic activity. The problem is it's a multifaceted problem. And the real challenge is this. Who can actually provide those services? Only the networks who have the necessary infrastructure, the necessary platforms, and they're commercially driven operations. They need to give a return to investment. Now, in the beginning, the South African network's gross return was very, very high. Today, that has dropped dramatically, and all the networks are making moderately reasonable to high income. Not massive. When you look at MTN's results, you look at Vodacom's results. Well, MTN's a bad one. They've had some issues. But you take Vodacom, which is part of the Vodafone International Group. Their margins are no higher overall than pretty much many others in the group.
Let me ask you this, because to my mind, it appears Telkom is cheaper.
At the moment, Telkom have got very aggressive, and suddenly they've got a lot cheaper. But their cost per, the biggest challenge really is that it comes down to affordability. If you can afford to put 150 Rand a month,
Yes.
you can get very cost-effective data.
Yes.
But if you're buying data ad hoc, use it, buy it as you use it,
'Cause I know
buying
that,
small bundles,
yeah.
that's when it costs too
Because
much.
with Telkom, I think they've got uncapped limits on
No, not on
access, or-
mobile. Not on mobile.
Well, it's on landline, right?
On certain landline packages.
But if
yes.
you have Wi-Fi connectivity with in your home, for instance, with
Correct, you can
Telkom,
have uncapped.
yeah.
But again, the cost of that is not, it's actually, you know what's so interesting? You can now buy mobile data cheaper than you can buy ADSL, which is a ridiculous situation.
Yeah.
Anywhere else in the world, fixed is normally a fraction of the cost of mobile.
Yeah.
So overall, my contention is that mobile is not terribly expensive. It's just unaffordable to the lower end of the market.
Now summarize this for me. All right? Let's help the parliamentarians. Let's help everybody who's upset. Let's fix the economy using data. Where should we start? What are the things that should be happening that are not happening at this moment?
Very simply, the first and most important thing is the high demand spectrum has to be allocated to the guys who can actually use it. It's wonderful for the government to talk about bringing new parties in and creating more competition and trying to assist those that previously had no access to the industry. The problem is this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It only works at scale. Unless you've got massive scale, you cannot make money out of telecommunications. And the only people who are positioned to do that are the current big guys, Telkom, MTN, Vodacom, Cell C. Those guys have the infrastructure, they have the capacity to roll out massive data networks and at prices that are affordable for the masses. And they can control that. That's the first and most important thing. The second thing is that generally they need to allow the free market economy to raise everybody's standard of living, to make things more affordable because there's more people out there. But as we said right at the beginning, there's a lot of anger. People are tired of promises. They're tired of struggling. They're tired of not being able to afford basic things like water, lights, data, for example. And I think that's boiling over into anger. This whole data must fall is very definitely a shout out to say we're tired of struggling. We want a little bit of help. And the best way to do that for me is managed free market. Don't let the market reign free entirely, but allow those that have the capacity to do the job that needs to be done, the necessary framework, including spectrum and policy regulation, to do what they need to do. And then government can sit back and say, you know what, guys, you're doing well. We want 100 meg for everybody as a basic human right. And then we can take it from there. But there is no free lunch. 100 meg times 50 million people is a lot of money.
Yeah.
No one gets that for nothing.
Okay, well, if I understand you saying, make the investments in the meantime, make money, and as you make money, then we take some
Correct,
of it, and
give
then
it
we
back.
distribute to those who cannot afford access.
Exactly.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Much appreciated, Stephen. That's the CEO of Strategy Wokx, Stephen Ambrose. So it's not as simple as just calling out and saying data must fall and it will fall. Certain considerations have got to be factored into the whole deliberations. We'll wait and see.